out of coincidence, I was playing in a band in a club called the Agora, which was a big rock club in Cleveland back in the 70s. And I also worked in a record store at the time, so I knew those guys. I had heard their first 3 records at that point. I was familiar with them. I was playing in the basement. They had a bar down there called The Mistake, and Daryl and John were playing upstairs in the big room at the Agora. And they were not really a big band yet, but they were kind of like, you knew of them. They had a few records out. And here they were coming to Cleveland to, play in a big club, probably half full. So I went upstairs and I met John after they finished their set. I saw their last couple songs, and I slipped him a tape. And that was that. And then I think probably 6 or 8 months later, I got a phone call from their manager, Tommy Mottola, who later on became quite an infamous music industry figure, who said, well, do you want to come up to New York and audition for Daryl and John's band because they need a guitarist? And of course said sure, and I jumped on a plane, and they sent me the new album that was coming out in a couple of weeks, with 5 titles circled. And I took my SG and put it on a plane with me, and we went up to New York City, and I auditioned for them. And it was the first time that I'd done anything, with a national level. I knew them, I knew they were really good. And when I heard that, what was then their 4th album, they had made another change. And Daryl and John were those kind of guys. They were always changing what they were doing. It was at SIR in New York City, a couple of doors down from Studio 54 on 54th Street. And it was a cattle call. So I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I had my guitar. I was going to New York. They said, show up here at 2:00. And there was like a hallway full of guitar players sitting around. And I thought, oh, I get it. All right, yeah, this is New York City. I'm probably not going to get this gig. So yeah, I auditioned, and it went really well. And I think what happened was they asked me to stay an extra night and then come back the next day and do it again. And then they hired me, yeah. Definitely covering the parts, if you're going to audition for somebody and you've got the record and there's some key signatures that you think are part of that song, learn those.
Were any of those songs that we now know as being...
Oh, yeah. It's funny, because I don't know if Sarah Smile was in the audition, right? But that was their first hit. And that was on that album. Gosh, I don't even know the rest of the songs at the moment. But anyhow, they gave me 5 songs to learn, and I learned them pretty good. And in those days, this was 1975. I think I just walked in the room and there was an amp, and I just plugged into the amp. I think it was a Super Reverb, which at that point I probably never even played through a Super Reverb. And with my SG, and we played. And I think, yeah, we did jam some. They were kind of, at that point they really were kind of branching out, and they were more experimental than you'd think. I guess from my perspective, so Daryl and John are super talented cats, man. And, I grew up in Cleveland playing all kinds of music. My dad was a guitar player. He would, push me into crazy gigs, Broadway shows coming to town. There's a book you got to be able to read. I was trying. He'd go, well, you're doing this one. I'd go like, I can barely read. He'd go, sure you can. He would be like, do this. To mostly playing in blues bands and rock and roll bands, and mostly blues bands. And I go up to New York City and meet Daryl and John, who are these Philadelphia kind of tinged soul dudes that were kind of folky originally and then evolved into this thing. And then their new album was really stretched out. It kind of had all these elements, plus a couple of tablespoons of the Beatles somehow. And when I met them and we played together, they sang so good that it freaked me out. It was like, I've never worked with anybody that was that good. They were total pros. They were probably in their 20s at the time. They just had it all going on. And I think at that point they said to me, so here's the deal, man. We're going to England. We got a new record coming out. We got a new record company, and they're going to bring us to London. It was RCA Records. And we're going to do a show for the record label in all of Europe. It's a private party at Ronnie Scott's famous jazz room, really. And we also have a gig at a theater in London because apparently we have some fans there. And okay, and that was it. We had 2 gigs and 10 days to get ready to do 90 minutes. So, you know, some serious studying. I hole up in my hotel room all night, you know, learning songs, and then we'd rehearse for hours. Got on a plane, went to London. The first thing we did was we played at this new Victoria Theatre, which is a great London house, real theater. And it was like packed. And it was also packed with British rock stars. You know, like people would go like, we want to see these new bands. People would go see who's playing. And I remember their record company guys would like come into the dressing room before we'd go on and say like, Pete Townsend's here, you know, and they keep coming back with who's here. The guys from Steely Dan are in town, they're here. And, you know, they kept doing that. It was like, wow, this is really something. So anyhow, we went out and did this show and we killed it. It was you know, we had a good night. It's the first time I ever played with them live. The next day, there used to be, you know, the Melody Maker and the New Music Express and something else. They were kind of, you know, England was a music mecca, obviously. And that was like their Rolling Stone and Circus Magazine. Back in the day in America, there were 3 or 4 music rags, right? Rolling Stone was the biggie. But in Britain, Melody Maker, and, you know, they had about 3 or 4 of them. And the day after we played our show, Daryl and John were on the front page in giant photos, and England fell in love with them instantly. They were like, you know, it was like, wow. And for me, you know, I was like, oh, this is cool. So that's how it works, you know. And they booked us a tour. You know, it was like, yeah, well, good. We're coming back, and we're going to do 6 weeks in the UK. And everybody was excited about that. And we came back to New York, and I think there was a possibility of a tour on the books. Maybe we're going to do some colleges on the East Coast or something, which I was, of course, super excited about. And right about that time, the song Sarah Smile for them started to pop up on the radio. Ironically, out of Cleveland. There was a DJ in Cleveland. It wasn't their single. It was a black station in Cleveland started playing Sarah Smile. And I think some people said, well, you know, maybe we should put that one out as a single. And that was their first hit. So I just stepped into that situation just as it ramped up for them. Of course, it was their 4th album. So here's the deal. I never recorded with Daryl and John. I was in their touring band. And those guys were, at that point, they were very tight, 2 guys, great management. Had a producer named Christopher Bond, who did a couple of records when I was in their band. And Chris was a brilliant guitarist and arranger. And so that's who played the guitar on their records. It was their producer, Chris. And which was great, man. And although 40 years later, Guthrie Trapp is playing with John, who's now kind of doing his own stuff. And it's back to rootsy stuff. Because when I joined their band, and John and I were guitar players, and when we would sit down with guitars, John was this sort of folk guitar, Doc Watson, finger-picking, you know, freight train kind of stuff. But yet Hall and Oates were doing this Philly soul-tinged music. It was really interesting. But that was obviously his roots. And 40 years later, he's starting to do that music again on his own. Guthrie, my pal, who's an amazing guitar player, is out there playing with John. And he brings me this 6 CD package back on a trip. He comes over to the house, and he says, hey, John gave this to me to give to you. And I was like, oh, that's cool. and it's signed, and it says, "Todd, you played your ass off" on the front of it. And I thought, this is really neat, man. And I open it up, and there's a booklet and stories of the songs and how they made the records, and some of their first demos are there, and a little, bit about each track. And it's 6 CDs long or something. And on the end of disc 1 is 5 live tracks from the New Victoria Theatre from October 1975. And I'm like, oh, that's why John sent this over. And I was like, wow, man, that's the first gig I played with them. It's the first time I walked on stage with them. And it was sort of a neat full circle little deal there to happen. But, here's the cool thing about that story, is that I did have an intro, an in, kind of like you'll be able to get backstage and meet the guys. Other than that, I slipped John Oates a tape. We said hello, we shook hands, and they jumped on their bus or whatever and left. And usually you think, okay, the tape's going in the trash can on the way out the door, and, that was fun. And 6 months later, I got a phone call. So you never know what's going to happen. And ever since that day, that that just taught me a great lesson, really. Show up and play in the basement bar, even if it sucks. You got a tape, put it in people's pockets, put them in the mailbox, send them around.